Hello, I'm Toycat, and welcome back to the A to Z of Geography. Today we are going to be talking about a letter that I am very excited about because the most populated country for it is not obvious to most people. I mean, is it Iran? Is it Italy? Is it this big country that's near Sri Lanka? It actually turns out it's none of those, and it's actually Indonesia. Indonesia is a true archipelago country. Lots of countries say they have over 10,000 islands, and Indonesia says they have 18,000, but really lots of those islands are just tiny little strips of land that no one's ever been to, but Indonesia means it when they say they're made up of islands. There are over 6,000 permanently populated islands, and how does that come together to make any semblance of a country? Well, the answer is in some ways it doesn't, and in some ways it makes one of the most successful ex-colonial countries. This will be a future big power, and not in like 100, 200 years. In the next 20 or 30 years, Indonesia is one of the rising stars of the world. How can that be? What's going on? What's the deal with Indonesia? Let's explain, because yeah, I also need to now. It's been 30 seconds and I've got the engagement bait. A lot of people are going to say, wait a minute, Toycat, India is the most populated country in the world. In fact, it's the most populated country in the world, period. And in case you're curious as to why we're not covering it, it's just because I made a whole video talking about everything I'd say today. It was 4 months ago even, so very recently. It's one of the best research videos I've made this year. If you want to check it out, it was one that was a lot of fun to make. Seriously, it's sitting on the channel next to a July 4th video where I bitterly complain about America leaving and say it was good for them to go anyway, or working holidays, or a 55-second video just talking about roads. You know, all these things are much worse than watching the Indian states, so go check that out if you want to see the I letter. But otherwise, let's talk about Indonesia, because it's one of the most fascinating countries that we haven't really dove into on this channel, and so let's start with their borders, which they're very strange. Any other island nation on the planet, you'd be able to easily say they don't border anyone. However, Indonesia is committed to their bit of being an island nation, but they still want to have some spicy borders, and so they border 3 separate nations, all exclusively on islands. The way this happens is that some of the most populated and largest islands on the planet happen to be within Indonesia's remit, and some of them are just so big that they can't exclusively belong to Indonesia, and so Borneo is the famous example of this. It is a place where the majority of the island belongs to Indonesia, but then they border 2 separate Malaysian provinces, and those 2 separate Malaysian provinces then border Brunei. It is very, very, very bizarre, but that is the situation on Borneo. It is the only place in the world outside of Cyprus, which sort of doesn't really count because most people don't recognize the third country, where 3 separate nations that are all recognized share just 1 island, and it's such a mess. There's so many borders going on here, but the other cases are actually 2 places that are effectively linked to Indonesia in some way. So Timor-Leste was one of the world's newest countries until South Sudan came to the party and ruined that for them. But Timor-Leste was the century's first new country, and Timor-Leste, fun fact, translates loosely into East-East because it's the local word for East and then Portuguese word for East. So fun fact, East-East over here got its independence in the early 2000s and has a very interesting double border with Indonesia, where the west half of the island, west-west if you want to, actually borders it and then has this separate little exclave right here. Very, very interesting. And the same thing happened with Papua New Guinea. This is a very interesting story of being like an ex-German colony that was kind of confiscated, and basically that means that because the internals of it weren't truly explored, they have this very, very straight border where they said west half ours, east half yours, and that kind of stuck. And to this day, the only exception to that is this nice river they found here, which slightly carves out that border, but otherwise, again, you can see some very colonial-looking straight lines, and that is because Indonesia is, of course, the Dutch's biggest colony around the world. I feel like most people are aware of what the UK accomplished with their colonies, and maybe France and Spain, and to a little bit Portugal too, because it's all kind of linked very closely. But the Dutch were very famous for colonizing lots of islands in the Caribbean and in the East Indies. If the British Raj, if India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, then this was the same for the Dutch. And the only reason they let it go is because while they were fighting a war for independence after World War II, the Americans said, yeah, if you don't stop resisting those people who are trying to get their country back, we won't give you aid to redevelop your country. And again, one of those many examples of not even soft power, like medium power from the US of being like, we won't give you money if you don't do what we want, and slowly shaping the world that way. But anyway, long story short, this was good for Indonesia, which got its independence as the United States of Indonesia, and that is how they ended up with their borders. Something, 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 colonial line from the Dutch, something, 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 colonial line of the British, and something, 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 well, actually, actually this is a group of people that they probably shouldn't have taken over. But we're gonna have to go with the narrative that there's actually nothing wrong they did there, even though there's a lot of wrong things that happened in there. Anyway, Indonesia has these free borders, and none of these are disputed. This is a really crazy thing to me because big powers like this often have this almost expansionist principle. However, Indonesia has no disputed territory on land. They dispute a tiny bit of sea territory, which we're not really talking about too much here, but they also have an interesting case of they did have a land dispute. The name of the island it's rough for me, but Ligatan, as well as another one in the area, were both claimed by both Indonesia and Malaysia. They went to an international court, and then they did the crazy thing where they didn't say, no, we disagree with you, international court that we agreed to preside by. They actually accepted it, and everyone in the country is very happy of this, and that's why no one has any bitter resentment about it. Did Malaysia steal everything from Indonesia? Even the culture of the island was stolen? It's very fun to me. Anyway, maybe fun is the wrong word, but they had one border dispute, and then they resolved it, meaning that there are no longer any border disputes in Indonesia. And indeed, I think the bigger question about Indonesia should be not like how do they deal with other countries, but how do they deal with themselves? I think that given how much territory Indonesia takes up, the distance, given that these islands are so different in culture and they're 5,000 kilometers apart, that's 3,228 miles, how is it humanly possible that anything gets done, and how do they divide themselves is the much more interesting question, which I can answer, because let's talk about provinces. Indonesia is split into 38 separate provinces, and despite the country being made of over 6,000 islands, it's not that different islands have their own administration, as you might assume if you were to look at the country about thinking about population distribution, which, by the way, looks something like this. This is the most populated island on the planet, by the way. But interestingly enough, when you look at Indonesia, they instead take some of the island chains and make them a big place, like the Riau Islands over here, or Bangka Belitung, or, there's lots of famous examples of this. Bali is another great example. And then they take some of the bigger islands and divide them into lots of different provinces. I think this is interesting because there is Jakarta, the capital city, which has its own special thing, but otherwise all of these provinces then have their own governor. There are some exceptions to this, so everything on Papua, because it was a later addition to Indonesia, every single one of those provinces has full autonomy as, to help the indigenous people out. It works out for them, I guess. And then there's also, this sounds so fake, but Yogyakarta, which is on the most populated island, doesn't have a governor that is elected and does all the stuff. Instead, they have a monarchy that works as their governor of the special region, because they were a country before, and so as a result, they get to kind of like pretend they're a country, and they have an elected monarchy, or not an elected monarchy, they have an unelected monarchy who functions as the governor, and one of them at one point was the vice president. Wait, and even though he was born in Washington, D.C.? Okay, wait, one sec. Sorry, is that... No, that's his death. His death was in Washington, D.C. That's more confusing in some ways. But long story short is, so instead of having elections in Yogyakarta, just whoever's the son of the last guy gets to be their governor. And, honestly, if that works for them, if that's what they actually want, then go for it, Indonesia. But the overall country is then governed centrally from Jakarta, the capital, and the leader of it. There's an interesting kind of controversy about this leader, because, and I want to mention it at least a little bit here today, because I did talk, I speak a little bit about countries which go through a poor political situation because they focus so much on ideals that they end up having political instability. Interestingly, Indonesia's the opposite. They had objectively one of the worst leaders, his name was Suharto. They had a military dictator who had a 32-year brutal and corrupt dictatorship. However, despite that, he had an ironclad rule on the country, and even crazier than that, one of the things that's very, very hard is he actually stepped down when there was widespread rioting. Once people decided it was enough, he actually knew the moment to step down and not to keep pushing on beyond the country, and then since then, they transitioned to democracy, which works, by the way. And I need to point out, this was you see this all the time in Indonesia, and no one references it like it's not the first thing you notice about the president, but why are they wearing those hats? It looks a bit like a fez, and fun fact, it actually is sort of related to the fez. It is it's like a Muslim piece of attire that is specific to Indonesia, and I think that's interesting personally. I also think it's interesting looking at the way this country elects itself, because not only does it have this overseas vote, not only does it have a capital, but also look how split the country has to be. Like, people 5,000 kilometers apart vote for different presidents, and they have to all just get along with it anyway. It's crazy that this democracy works, in my opinion, but it somehow does. does. And a part of that was probably having a brutal dictatorship. So even when you get the wrong guy in, at least he's not gonna, kill you and all your family, I guess. I mean, 500,000 lives. That's a lot of people that have to die. I mean, Indonesia has 300 million, but 500,000 lives is bad regardless. However, I think it's an interesting case of a country that has the, I think one of the things that a lot of countries are driven by, especially a lot of people talking about those countries from their safe comforts in the West, you'll be like, no, you should just always do the right thing. But there's a weird thing in escaping the middle income trap where it seems as though stability is so important that it's, I guess I would say, democracy is a treat that we get. It's almost like an inefficiency we can afford for our freedoms. But it seems as though one of the best ways to get over that gap is by doing that. Because as we talk about the demographics, it should be mentioned that Indonesia is really, really, really nailing this. I think Indonesia is a middle-income country, like many others, but Indonesia is one of the very few countries that is set to actually overcome that gap. And so, in case you're curious, here is the list of the biggest GDPs in the world right now, the biggest economies. Right now, Indonesia is 16th right here, which is fairly impressive. 1.3 billion gross domestic product. I think it would be extra impressive if it weren't like, well, a country with a tiny fraction of their population is a third their size. But it's impressive. And if you look at this chart shows GDP here, GDP growth here, population here, and GDP per capita here. So you can see the middle-income countries of the world, that is to say Mexico and Brazil. So here is Brazil right here. Here is Mexico. They get to about $10,000 per capita, and then their economies start slowing down to Western rates, basically. Like compare it to South Korea and Mexico are growing by similar amounts, but South Korea is 3 times richer. Australia and Brazil grow by similar amounts, but Australia is 7 times wealth, 7 times more economy per capita, and so it's a big problem that all middle-income countries get to, but Indonesia actually looks set to overcome this, partially because it's got a large and growing population at the same time as seeing a large and growing economy, but it is actually on track to be the 4th largest economy in the world by as soon as 2045 by some estimates, which is a very, very, very big deal. This will be one of the major players in the world economy, and I do want to say that while we're talking about it a little bit, I want to share my own personal experience about it. Because, looking around, by the way, special region of Yogyakarta is here. Just want to point it out, does look very different to the rest of Indonesia. The fact that Indonesia can exist as a country is one of those incredibly important and impressive things that kind of boils down to, in some extent, they're embracing of the, taking it. Also, I don't know what I did wrong to Google Maps. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you, Google. There we go. As you can see, very, very interesting place. Also, say no to drugs. Should we go check out that sign? Yep, say no to drugs. It's an easy thing to do. Instead, go ride your horse or your motorbike. You have a much more fun time. But yeah, I want to mention my own personal experience. Is I have been to Indonesia. It's on my fun list of countries that I have visited. And like all other countries, I visited them in like my early 20s. I have to say that now because there's a big gap of no travel in my mid 20s. Who knows why? But basically, I visited, and it was the first country that I don't want to say scarred me, but made me realize you can't just show up to parts of the world and go for a walk in big cities. Because I remember, it must have been this street in particular. I just remember walking around and being like, oh yeah, I almost fell in a hole in the street that would have taken me right into the sewers. It is a crazy, crazy, crazy city, and it's known for its insane traffic, by the way. It's wild how this city even functions. They have one of those rush hours that's just like, yeah, anywhere from like 5 to like 1, and then from like 1:30 to like 9 p.m. That's rush hour. So as long as you don't travel in those times, you should be able to get places. It is insanity that this functions at all. But yet it does. It does have to be said that the country of Indonesia not only functions, not only keeps it all itself together, but is managing to grow despite that. And the lessons that can be learned from it, I hope are not, we should all have brutal military dictators, but I hope also shows that even despite a brutal military dictator, by having the right policies at the right time and by committing to actually, keeping a country together and growing it, making hard decisions, weirdly enough, is more success in the long run than making easy decisions that don't actually work out. And I hope that's one thing we learn from this series, because Indonesia is a cool place. And look, and also honestly, doesn't it feel a bit messy that like you can look at this map right here and say that it's one place, like it goes green on my map, like I visited it all. I've always thought it's weird that I visit Moscow and now all of Russia goes green. But how can you really ever visit an island country? I am sure Borneo is wildly different to what's going on in Jakarta, which is wildly different to Bali. I mean, this is meant to be one of the most liberal parts of the country. I bet there's not even signs saying say no to drugs if I go to a random point of the country. Look, no sign saying that. There's a taxi driver. I bet he'd tell me where to get drugs if I asked nicely. And also, they drive on the left side of the road. Man, these are my people right here. Speaking of my people, do you think they drive on the left side of the road everywhere? There's no way I wouldn't have Did I really not notice that? I got a few taxis around the area, or motorcycle taxis. Scary situation, by the way. They drive on the left. You know what? 10 out of 10. Indonesia can't do any better. Speaking of can't do any better, I want to point out, I was reading some comments recently. I was having some fun with it. And Jacob Lorenzana has said, you've haunted my dreams every night, waking up in a sweat thinking about what I've been told to do, constantly receiving ads about air fryers. The only way I can stop this air fryer is to come back to this video and buy it. I just bought the air fryer. I hope you're happy. And I was like, oh, that's a funny bit. But I checked. And, okay, this is not an air fryer, but I checked, and as you can see right here, there was an ordered item the same time as that comment, and according to this, the 5 items purchased in December are a eShop gift card, the Vice President's black wife, interesting, the digital hydrometer, indoor thermometer, a foldable drying rack for clothes, and interestingly enough, a 14-in-1 pressure cooker, steam fryer, smart lid, air fries, proofs, and more with 2-layer capacity. You know, you're gonna be living life good. And by the way, just while I was looking here, I noticed my India video, which really recommend checking out if you want to learn about the country. But I noticed that video was alongside my apartment tour, which means I should be able to show you, after an ad, I should be able to show you.
Great. I never have to worry.
Right in here somewhere, there is my 14-in-1 air fryer pressure cooker with all the stuff. It's right there. Look at it. It's hanging out. And yeah, this was my actually that thing was a lifesaver. It makes rice so good. And you know, I'm Asian, so I'm allowed to say that. Anyway, speaking of things I'm allowed to say, you're making your kitchen self-slanted. I think yeah, this was a really cool apartment, by the way. Kind of sad about it. Not sad about not paying that anymore. But what I am sad about is yeah, really cool place. Look at that, the Vegas Strip in the background. Speaking of things that are in the background, this video has been in the background of your life, but it must come to an end, and tomorrow is J? H-I-J, yep, tomorrow is J. What is your guess for the most populated J country? The first thing that comes to mind is Jamaica, but it has to be Japan, right? There's no way it's not Japan. Or is there? Maybe a lot of people have gone to Jamaica since I was last there. Oh, also, one last update. I am seriously going to Haiti for my 50th country. I've booked my flights, and oh, actually, speaking of Indonesia travel advice, you just can't go to the Mount Sinabung area. You can't go to Mount Semeru, and otherwise you're fine. Isn't that nice? Isn't that wonderful? You gotta get travel insurance though. Also, you know, try not to be too LGBT. But, you know, I think that seems like worldwide advice. Also, they're very likely to carry out attacks. It's not. It might happen. It has happened. And it will happen anywhere that a person would go. And also in any celebration. And also, there were recent attacks last year and the year before and the year before and the year before and the year before. But outside of those, everything's fine. You should visit. It'll be great. Go to Bali. They drive on the left. It's worth the risk. Anyway, thank you for watching. Second channel. Don't care about your life, apparently. Goodbye.